All right, so we are diving in today to a topic that might sound a little dry, but trust me, it's actually super interesting.
Yes.
We're talking about how Congress can regulate states.
That's right.
And it gets into this whole fascinating area of federalism and states' rights.
Yeah.
And this really surprising principle that I bet a lot of people haven't even heard of, it's called anti-commandeering.
Bit of a head scratcher at first.
Yeah, it really is. So we're going to unpack all of that today.
We're going to take a deep dive.
Exactly. We've got some legal summaries to work with. So think of this as like understanding the rule book for how our government actually works.
Absolutely.
So, okay, to start things off, my basic understanding is that Congress can regulate states just like they regulate businesses or individuals, right?
That's right.
Yeah.
When Congress exercises its powers, let's say under the Commerce Clause, to regulate commerce,
Right.
those laws, they apply across the board to states too.
Okay, that makes sense. But I feel like there's got to be a catch, right?
There is.
Because if the federal government can just tell states what to do,
Yeah. Doesn't that kind of undermine the whole idea of states' rights?
well, that's where this principle of anti-commandeering comes in. And it basically means that Congress can't force states to carry out federal programs.
Hold on, wait a minute. That is kind of mind-blowing. Isn't that like saying that the head coach can't actually make the players run drills?
Yeah, it's a little bit like that.
So help me understand how this works in real life.
All right. Well, let's take a look at a really important Supreme Court case, Garcia v. San Antonio. This was back in 1985.
Okay.
And the court ruled that Congress could apply federal laws like minimum wage standards to state employers.
So does that mean Congress just has free rein to regulate anything and everything within the states?
Well, not quite. Another key case, New York v. U.S. in 1992, put some pretty clear limits on that.
Okay.
In that case, Congress tried to basically force states to deal with radioactive waste, and the Supreme Court said, nope, you can't do that.
So Congress can set the goals, but they can't tell the states exactly how to achieve them. Exactly. They can offer incentives or encourage states, but they can't just hijack a state's legislative process to make them do what they want.
Okay. So that makes sense for like state governments as a whole, but what about individual state officials? Can Congress tell them what to do?
That's where the case Prince v. U.S. comes in. This one was from 1997, and it involved the Brady Handgun Violence Prevention Act.
Oh, okay.
Congress wanted local law enforcement to handle background checks for gun purchases. But the Supreme Court said, no way. You can't just deputize state officials to enforce federal law.
Wow. So it's like saying your local sheriff can't be forced to do the FBI's job.
Exactly.
This isn't just some abstract legal theory. It has real consequences for how things work on the ground.
Absolutely. And this whole area of law, it's really more like an ongoing debate than settled law.
I can see that. It's like this constant push and pull between federal power and states' rights.
Yeah, and in the way these principles are interpreted, it's constantly evolving.
Okay, so we've got this anti-commandeering principle, and we've seen how it's played out in some major court cases. But let's zoom out for a second. Why should any of this matter to, well, anyone listening?
It all comes down to this core concept of federalism,
Okay.
which is enshrined in the 10th Amendment to the Constitution.
Right.
And the 10th Amendment is all about reserving any powers not explicitly given to the federal government, to the states, or to the people.
So it's about making sure states have a voice and aren't just following orders from the federal government.
Precisely. It's about maintaining that balance of power that we've been talking about.
And that balance is constantly being tested, especially in today's political climate.
Absolutely.
So I think we've laid a really good foundation here
I think so, too.
for understanding this whole concept of anti-commandeering and why it matters.
Definitely.
But we've only just scratched the surface.
Yeah, we've got a lot more to dig into.
We're going to look at some specific examples of how this plays out in different policy areas.
We'll see how it affects everything from environmental regulations to healthcare.
So stay tuned because this deep dive is about to get even more interesting.
It is.
You know, thinking about this whole federalism thing, I bet it gets really messy when you're talking about something like environmental policy.
Absolutely. It's
Yeah.
a great example of where this tension between federal and state power really comes to a head. You know, think about air and water, quality standards, climate change regulations, how we manage public lands. It's a constant tug of war.
Right. And then you throw this anti-commandeering principle into the mix. Congress might want to set these nationwide standards,
Right.
but they can't just order the states around.
Exactly. They have to rely on a mix of incentives, like offering grants for certain programs,
Yes.
or they can use what's called conditional preemption.
Conditional preemption. Whoa, that sounds intense. What does that even mean?
It's basically like saying to a state,
Yeah.
okay, you don't have to follow our exact rules,
Mm-hmm.
but if you don't, we're going to step in and we're going to replace your state law with our federal regulations.
Oh, so it's like a way for the federal government to kind of exert some influence without directly commandeering the states.
Precisely.
But doesn't that create a situation where states that are maybe struggling financially, they might feel pressured to comply even if it goes against what they think is best?
Yeah, that's a major point of contention.
Mm.
Critics argue that this kind of conditional preemption, it can be coercive.
Mm-hmm.
Essentially twisting states' arms to fall in line with the federal government.
Right.
They say it undermines the whole idea of federalism by giving the feds too much leverage.
It's like this constant balancing act,
It is.
trying to make sure the federal government can do what it needs to do to handle these big national issues,
Mm-hmm.
but also respecting what the states want to do.
Right. It's a tough one. And that line,
The fine line.
where that line between encouragement and coercion lies,
Right.
it can be very blurry. It's a
Mm.
debate that's still raging on in legal and political circles.
This is what I find so fascinating about this whole topic is it's not just some dusty old legal doctrine. It has real consequences for how our country functions.
Absolutely.
It affects everybody.
You hit the nail on the head. Think about healthcare. The Affordable Care Act,
Yeah.
Obamacare,
Right.
relied heavily on state cooperation to expand Medicaid. Some states jumped on board, others resisted, and it led to this patchwork of healthcare coverage across the country.
Right.
It's a perfect illustration of how these federalism principles have very real implications.
It makes you think, what's the best way to balance these competing interests?
Right.
Is it more important to have like a uniform national policy, even if it means going against what some states want?
Mm.
Or should we prioritize state autonomy, even if it means having like different approaches in different parts of the country?
Those are the million-dollar questions, and there's no simple answer. It depends on the specific issue, the political climate at the time, the values that we prioritize as a society. The key is that we have these conversations. We understand what's at stake, and we participate in the debate as informed citizens.
So can you give me a concrete example of how this anti-commandeering principle plays out in the real world?
Sure. Let's take something like environmental regulations. Say Congress wants to set national air quality standards. They can't just force each state to adopt specific policies to meet those standards.
Right.
The states have some freedom to decide how they reach those goals, which can lead to different approaches across the country.
So it's like Congress is giving the states a destination, but letting them choose their own route to get there.
Exactly.
But that brings up another question. What if a state just flat out refuses to cooperate with a federal mandate? What happens then?
So that's where things get even more complicated.
Hmm.
Congress has a few tools in their belt. They can try to sweeten the deal with funding, like offering grants to states that implement certain programs. But they can also play hardball and use that conditional preemption we talked about earlier, basically threatening to replace state law with federal regulations if the state doesn't cooperate.
It's like a carrot and stick approach.
It is.
But doesn't that create a situation where states with fewer resources, might feel pressured to comply, even if it goes against their own priorities?
You're right. That's a major concern. Critics argue that this kind of pressure from the federal government, it undermines the whole spirit of federalism. They worry that it gives the federal government too much control over the states.
So it sounds like there's this constant back and forth
There is.
between the federal government and the states trying to find that right balance.
Right.
Where does the Supreme Court fit into all of this?
The Supreme Court plays a crucial role. They're the ones who ultimately interpret the Constitution and decide whether a law or an action by Congress or the states is constitutional. They're like the referees in this whole federalism game, making sure everyone's playing by the rules.
It's like they're constantly having to draw the line between what the federal government can do and what the states can do.
Exactly. And sometimes those lines can be pretty blurry. There's a lot of debate and disagreement about where those lines should be drawn. And these debates often reflect deeper ideological differences about the role of government and the balance of power in our society.
It sounds like we're constantly kind of renegotiating this balance of power between the federal government and the states.
We are.
And I'm guessing this isn't just a historical thing. This is playing out in current events all the time.
Absolutely. Just look at the debates happening right now over issues like immigration, gun control, environmental regulations, even things like marijuana legalization. These are all areas where federal and state laws sometimes clash and where the principles of federalism are constantly being tested and reinterpreted.
It's interesting to think about how this anti-commandeering doctrine might impact individual rights. It's not just about states' rights, right?
You're right, it's not just about the states. It's also about protecting individual liberties. The Bill of Rights, as you know, was initially meant to limit the power of the federal government, not the states.
Right. But over time, the Supreme Court has incorporated many of those rights into the 14th Amendment, which applies to the states as well.
Exactly.
So now states can't infringe on certain fundamental rights, even if they disagree with federal law.
Right. So you have this complex interplay between federalism, individual rights, and the role of the courts in interpreting these principles. And it's all part of this ongoing effort to balance the power of government with the rights of individuals and the autonomy of the states.
So this anti-commandeering principle, it's not just some abstract legal concept. It has real-world consequences for all of us.
That's the key takeaway. This principle shapes the laws we live on, the taxes we pay, the services we receive from the government. It influences who gets to make decisions about education, healthcare, environmental protection, countless other areas of public policy.
It affects how our government works, and ultimately it affects our lives.
Right? And understanding these principles and how they play out in real life, it's crucial for being an informed and engaged citizen.
I'm starting to realize that this whole federalism thing is a lot more complicated and nuanced than I first thought. It's not just about states' rights versus federal power. It's about finding that sweet spot, that balance that allows us to address national issues effectively, but also respecting the diversity and autonomy of the states.
That's a great way to put it. It's about finding that balance. And it's a balance that we're constantly adjusting and renegotiating as a society.
This deep dive has really opened my eyes to how much goes on behind the scenes of our government. It's like a whole other world that most people don't even realize exists.
And it's a world that's constantly evolving. The challenges facing our country are always changing, and the way we balance federal and state power will have to adapt along with those challenges.
So what are some of the big questions we need to be thinking about when it comes to this balance of power in the future?
Well, one of the biggest challenges we face is how to apply these principles of federalism in an increasingly interconnected world.
Right.
With technology constantly evolving. It's easier than ever for the federal government to exert influence in areas that were traditionally left to the states.
I see what you mean. Think about issues like data privacy, cybersecurity, social media regulation. These are all areas where the lines between state and federal jurisdiction can get blurry.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So how do we protect state autonomy while also addressing national and even global challenges that require coordinated action? That's a question that we're going to be grappling with for years to come.
It sounds like the future federalism is going to be shaped by how we navigate these new and evolving challenges. What advice would you give to our listeners about how to stay informed and engaged in this ongoing conversation about the balance of power in our country?
I think the most important thing is to stay curious. Keep asking questions, keep learning, and keep engaging in the debate. It's through these conversations that we can figure out how to create a system of government that works for everyone.
This has been a fascinating deep dive into the world of federalism and the anti-commandeering doctrine. I'm walking away with a whole new appreciation for how complex and nuanced this issue really is.
I'm glad to hear that. And remember, this is just the beginning of the conversation. There's always more to learn and explore.
You know, it's funny to think that this whole idea of anti-commandeering, which seems so important to how our government works,
Right.
it's not actually spelled out anywhere in the Constitution.
Right. It's not like one of the amendments or anything.
Yeah, it's not like the founding fathers had a, thou shalt not commandeer commandment or something.
Exactly.
So how did we get from the Constitution to this, pretty well-established principle of anti-commandeering?
We got to remember, the framers of the Constitution, they were just coming out of a system where the states had most of the power.
Right.
And they were really, really wary of creating a strong central government that could become tyrannical.
Yeah, they had just fought a revolution to get away from that, so
Exactly.
it makes sense.
So they created this system of federalism where power is divided between the national government and the states.
Right.
And the 10th Amendment, like we talked about, makes it very clear that any powers not specifically given to the federal government are reserved for the states or the people.
So it's like this kind of unspoken agreement baked into the whole structure of our government.
Exactly.
That the feds can't just boss the states around.
Right. It's about preserving that balance of power.
Okay. But it hasn't always been smooth sailing, right?
Of course not.
There have been times when the federal government has tried to, overstep its boundaries and
Definitely.
and the states have pushed back.
Absolutely. It's like this ongoing dance between federal power and states' rights.
Sometimes one takes the lead, sometimes the other.
Right. Think about the Civil War. That was ultimately a fight over this very issue.
Wow. Yeah, that's a really stark example.
It is. And that struggle, it continues to this day.
Oh, for sure. Just look at all the debates we're having now about immigration, gun control, environmental regulations, all of it.
Exactly. And that's what makes this concept so fascinating. It's not static. It's constantly evolving and adapting to the challenges we face as a society.
So looking ahead, how do you see this whole idea of anti-commandeering playing out in the future?
Well, I think one of the biggest challenges we face is how technology is changing the game.
Oh, yeah, that's a good point.
As the world becomes more and more interconnected, it's getting easier and easier for the federal government to exert influence in areas that were traditionally handled by the states.
I see what you mean. Like, think about data privacy or cybersecurity. These are issues that cross state lines.
Exactly.
It's hard to imagine any one state trying to tackle those problems on its own.
Right. So how do we balance the need for national action in these areas with the principle of state autonomy?
Right. How do we protect states' rights while also addressing challenges that really do require like a coordinated national response?
That's a tough question.
Yeah.
And it's one that we're going to have to figure out as a society.
It's like technology is blurring the lines between what's a state issue and what's a federal issue.
It is. And it makes this whole question of the balance of power even more complex.
So as we wrap up this deep dive, what's the one key takeaway you want our listeners to walk away with?
I want them to understand that this principle of anti-commandeering, it's not just some abstract legal theory.
Right.
It has a real impact on all of our lives. It shapes the laws that govern us, the taxes we pay, the services we receive.
Ultimately, the kind of society we live in.
Exactly.
Well said. Well, this has been a truly eye-opening deep dive. Thanks for joining us on this journey into the world of federalism and anti-commandeering.
My pleasure. It's been great talking about this with you.
It really has. I feel like I've learned a lot, and I hope our listeners have too. It's been fascinating to explore the rules of the game that shape our nation.
Absolutely. And remember, the conversation doesn't end here. Keep learning, keep questioning, and keep engaging in our democracy.
Well said. We'll see you next time on The Deep Dive.